Anne of Brittany, twice Queen of France and almost Holy Roman Empress, was a remarkable figure in European history. She became queen at a young age, inherited Brittany when she was just 11, and was involved in a complex series of political marriages and royal struggles. Despite her desire for the independence of Brittany, Anne found herself repeatedly caught in the political machinations of France, which sought to absorb Brittany into its kingdom. Throughout her life, she had to navigate numerous challenges, including family tragedies and forced marriages, but she also patronized Renaissance art and became a significant historical figure in her own right. Anne was born on January 25th or 26th, 1477, in Nantes, Brittany. Her father, Francis II, was the Duke of Brittany, located in the northwestern corner of modern-day France. His first wife, Margaret of Brittany, passed away at the age of 25, and his second wife, Margaret of Foix, was the daughter of Eleanor, Queen of Navarre. The second Duchess Margaret lived just long enough to provide the Duke with two daughters, Anne and Elizabeth. Their governesses taught them French and a bit of Latin, but the girls were never taught the Breton language, the native tongue of their homeland. Instead, Breton tutors were brought in to teach them the finer skills expected of noble ladies, such as dancing, singing, and music. But there was little emphasis on politics or statecraft. Anne's early life was marked by a physical challenge. She was born with a congenital hip displacement. From a young age, she was trained to hide her limp, wearing specially designed shoes to compensate for her shorter leg. When Anne was 9, her mother died, and her father's health began to deteriorate. At the time, the laws of succession were not entirely clear, but male heirs were generally preferred. However, the only remaining heirs to the House of Montfort were Anne, Elizabeth, and their cousin, Nicholas of Blois. After a failed attempt by their cousin to sell her claim to the duchy to King Louis XIII of France, Francis II, Anne's father sought to protect Brittany's independence by engaging in a long and bitter struggle with France known as the Mad Wars. King Louis XV, known as the Universal Spider for his political cunning, was determined to bring Brittany under French control. To hold off France, Francis had his daughter officially recognized as the heir to the Duchy of Brittany in 1486, but in order to prevent future threats to her succession, Anne needed to marry a powerful monarch. This made Anne a highly sought-after bride. Her father negotiated several marriage contracts on her behalf, keeping each of her suitors unaware of the others. Each potential husband believed he was the only one in line to inherit Brittany, leading to a complex web of political intrigue, with suitors offering troops and money to support Francis in his war against France. During this time, England was embroiled in the Wars of the Roses. Edward IV, the leader of the Yorkist faction, had defeated his cousin Henry VI and become king. Francis quickly betrothed Anne to Edward IV's son, Edward, Prince of Wales. Meanwhile, two remaining Lancaster supporters, Jasper Tudor and his nephew Henry Tudor, fled to France. Their ship was blown off course and landed in Brittany, where Francis offered them shelter. He even arranged for Henry Tudor to be betrothed to Anne and supported their failed attempt to invade England. However, in 1483, when Edward IV died, Anne's original fiancé became King Edward V. Unfortunately, their marriage was never to be, as Edward V and his brother were imprisoned. The princes, who had been the rightful heirs to the throne, disappeared within the Tower of London, replaced by their uncle, King Richard III. During this period, Francis II, Duke of Brittany, suffered frequent bouts of illness. In one of these, his treasurer saw an opportunity to profit and struck a deal to hand over the Tudors to King Richard in exchange for a hefty ransom and 300 archers. Just before the deal could be finalized, the Tudors were warned and managed to escape. When the Duke recovered, he was furious and had his treasurer hanged. However, the Tudors had already found refuge with France, Brittany's enemy, who offered them much better support. This aid proved useful when Henry Tudor used it for his successful invasion of England, ultimately leading to Richard III's death at the Battle of Bosworth. The Tudor dynasty was born. Now, King Henry VII discarded Anne of Brittany for a more politically advantageous marriage to Elizabeth of York. In 1483, Louis XI of France died, and his daughter, Anne of Beaujeu, became regent for his 13-year-old son, Charles VIII. She, too, employed underhanded tactics against Brittany. To counter this, Francis arranged several secret betrothals for his daughter to prominent figures: Maximilian, Archduke of Austria and son of the Holy Roman Emperor, Louis, Duke of Orléans, Jean Thaire of the Prince of Orange, Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and Vicomte Jean II of Rouen. Many of these suitors provided troops and funding for Francis during the Battle of St. Aubin. Despite this support, Francis was defeated and forced to sign the Treaty of Sablé, which made Brittany a vassal state of France. Although Francis could remain duke, his children could only marry with French approval. In the months following, Francis fell from his horse and on his deathbed made Anne swear never to submit to French subjugation. He passed away at the age of 55. Anne was crowned Duchess of Brittany at the young age of 13, and soon arguments arose about which of her many suitors she should marry. Anne had her own opinions and outright rejected Alain of Albret, calling him repulsive. She expressed a strong preference for Maximilian of Austria. In 1490, they were married by proxy, and Anne became Queen of the Romans. However, Maximilian was too occupied with politics to fetch his bride, leaving Anne waiting. During her wait, King Charles VIII of France intervened. He had been betrothed to Maximilian's 3-year-old daughter, Margaret, who had been raised at the French court and became a hostage. Charles laid siege to Anne's castle, and after a 2-month battle, Anne's 9-year-old sister, Elizabeth, died when the castle fell. Anne had no choice but to submit to the French, but she proudly refused all the French princes the king offered. Eventually, Charles had no choice but to offer himself as a suitor, and Anne accepted. Maximilian protested to Pope Innocent VI, arguing that his bride had been stolen and that the groom had already been betrothed to his daughter, Margaret. However, the law, as often happened in royal politics, favored possession over principle, and Charles sent his envoys to the Pope with a generous bribe to secure an annulment and a papal dispensation. Charles and Anne were closely related, within the forbidden 4th degree of consanguinity, making their marriage illegal in the eyes of the Church. But as was frequently the case, dynastic advantage took precedence over health concerns for future children. The marriage contract was seen as a land grab, intended to bring Brittany fully under French control. It stipulated that the surviving spouse would retain possession of the duchy, and that if Charles died without a male heir, Anne would have to marry his successor, thereby giving France a second chance to annex Brittany. Charles kept Margaret of Austria as a high-class hostage for another 10 years to ensure that her father, Maximilian, wouldn't protest too strongly. Eventually, Margaret was allowed to return home, but Charles proceeded with the marriage to Anne before receiving an official response from the Pope. On the morning of December 6, 1491, Anne of Brittany, now 14 years old, arrived at her wedding in grand style. She traveled in a magnificent coach, draped in yards of precious cloth of gold, and was wrapped in a coat made of 139 sable pelts to keep warm from the winter chill. After the ceremony, the newlyweds were toasted in the grand hall of Château de Loches. Anne was described as a slim, rosy-cheeked girl, while her 21-year-old husband, Charles VIII of France, was less fortunate in the looks department. Charles was described as ugly, small, and ill-formed, with a large aquiline nose out of proportion to his face and swollen lips that perpetually hung open. Anne brought 2 beds with her to the royal chambers, indicating how serious she was about her new role as the queen consort. Yet personal feelings were secondary. Her duty was clear. She was to bear the king's children. Over the course of their 7-year marriage, Anne delivered 6 children, an average of 1 every 14 months. Just 2 months after their wedding, Anne was already pregnant when she was crowned and anointed at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, becoming the first queen consort of France to be crowned there. Throughout her pregnancy, Charles was overly attentive, ensuring she wasn't overly tired and never traveled unnecessarily. The House of Valois was suffering from a drought of male heirs, and Charles was desperate for a son. Charles's unchecked anxiety became an annoyance to the doctors and midwives during Anne's labor, but despite his nerves, everything went well. At 4 a.m., Anne gave birth to a healthy, well-formed baby boy, who was immediately given the title of Dauphin of France. In the 16th century, it was traditional to celebrate new mothers by baking them a special sweet treat called a groaning cake. Today, you can celebrate new moms or seasoned veterans with products like Cinderaki. I gave my mom a rose bubble box, which she absolutely loved. The bubbles were so much fun, and the gorgeous box looked like something out of a fairy tale. Cinderake offers creative and unique gifts for graduations, birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, ensuring that special moments are unforgettable. While Anne rested in bed to recover, her son was dressed in cloth of gold and baptized as Charles Hollande. The greatest men in the land carried the candle basin and towel, and baby Charles was doted on by his parents. At 18 months old, he was given his own household away from his parents, a long-held royal tradition. Anne mourned the separation, frequently sending gifts and requesting regular reports on her son's health. She visited him often and found joy in teaching him to pray. Charles VIII, his father, called him the most beautiful of gems and made sure his son was well protected at his home in Amboise. Hunting was strictly forbidden in the surrounding forests, out of fear that a rogue arrow might find its way into the nursery. Only 4 of the city's gates remained unlocked, much to the frustration of local residents. Royal guards checked everyone entering the city to ensure that no one with malicious intent could approach the heir. Charles even hired a hermit to pray continuously for his precious son. The Dauphin, an active and bright child, was speaking fluently by the age of 3. He showed potential to be an excellent king. However, shortly after his 3rd birthday, a measles epidemic struck Amboise. Despite the precautions, the young Dauphin could not escape the germs. His father, Charles, could never have anticipated this turn of events. On December 16th, Charles VIII was devastated by the death of his only son. Despite his grief, his doctors advised him to remain cheerful, so Charles put on a brave face, even as he buried his beloved child. Anne, however, heeded no such advice and sank into deep mourning. Her grief, compounded by the recent loss of 2 stillborn children, led to fears for her mental stability. Soon after the death of her son, Anne was pregnant once again. Her 4th child, named Charles after his lost older brother, became Dauphin of France. However, he lived only a month. This 4th loss was too much for Anne to bear, and she retreated from court in despair. Yet as time went on, she had to return to her queenly duties. She gave birth to 2 more children, François and Anne, both of whom died within hours of their birth. Not a single one of Charles and Anne's 6 children survived. The reasons behind Anne's tragic reproductive history remain unclear, as medical research on the matter is limited. Since her remains were destroyed during the French Revolution, forensic study is no longer possible. However, like many royals, the genetic hazards of inbreeding are a strong possibility. The death of 6 children was not the only issue in the royal marriage. Political conflicts also caused tensions. Anne was intelligent and determined, but her husband refused to let her have any say in the governance of Brittany, or even to use the title of Duchess. She was not allowed any power in France either. When Charles was away, he left his elder sister, Anne of Beaujeu, as regent, and the 2 women became bitter rivals. Charles, too, was unfaithful and made no secret of his numerous mistresses. With little to do but bear children, Anne spent her time in her luxurious royal palaces in the Loire Valley, where she had a chapel built at Château de Clous, an architectural work that later inspired Leonardo da Vinci. King Charles spent much of his time in Italy, fighting the Spanish for control of the peninsula. He took the throne of Naples and laid claim to the throne of Jerusalem. His conquests nearly bankrupted France, but he did manage to make Anne queen of 4 different realms. Despite all of this, what Anne truly wanted was to return to Brittany. In April 1498, Charles was in Amboise with Anne when he accidentally struck his head on a door lintel. He thought he had hurt his pride more than his skull, and the royal couple continued to attend a game of real tennis. While there, Charles made a casual remark to an archbishop, expressing a wish to never sin again for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, his wish was granted in the worst possible way. On their way home, Charles fell into a coma. The blow to his head had caused a cranial hemorrhage. He was rushed back to the chateau where doctors hovered over him, trying to decide how to help. But Charles died 9 hours later at the age of 27. His 21-year-old widow, Anne, did the expected 40 days of mourning, wearing all white, the traditional color for royal widows. However, inwardly, she was thrilled to finally be able to return to Brittany. According to her marriage contract, she was now in full possession of her homeland, and as a wealthy widow, she would no longer be under the control of any man. Anne was technically bound to marry Charles's heir, his second cousin and brother-in-law, Louis XIV, who was now King Louis XIV of France. But as he was already married, Anne assumed she was finally free of French control. She gleefully returned home to Brittany and took charge of the government. She appointed counselors who would support her plans and issued gold coins bearing her name and likeness. But just months into her newfound freedom, the King of France pulled the rug out from under her. Louis had been married for 22 years to Charles VI's sister, Joan of France. Joan was born with some physical abnormalities, and physicians suspected she might be sterile. It is even possible that she was intersex. Her father had forced Louis to marry her to extinguish the Orléans branch of the House of Valois. Louis resented the marriage and his wife, although the union had helped him secure the throne. Once he became king, Louis appealed to the Pope for an annulment. Instead of using the usual excuse of consanguinity, Louis decided to publicly humiliate Joan by testifying about her deformities, thereby making their marriage even more scandalous. Louis XIV went to great lengths to annul his marriage to Joan of France, even claiming that it was impossible for him to consummate the marriage. He even accused her of using witchcraft to strike him impotent. Joan, however, fought back, presenting witnesses who testified that Louis had boasted about having mounted my wife 3 or 4 times during the night. Despite this, Pope Alexander VI sided with the French king, and Joan lost her throne. Nevertheless, she made out well in the end, being granted a generous pension and founding a convent where she spent her remaining years doing good deeds, free from her unloving husband. As for Louis, he turned his attention to Anne of Brittany, who was known for her fertility and offered him another opportunity to secure Brittany for France. But Anne, now older and wiser, was determined to take control of her fate in this third marriage. The new contract stipulated that Anne would be free to use the title of Duchess of Brittany, while Louis would technically be the ruler of the duchy. However, Anne would be allowed to govern it, and their second child, whether male or female, would inherit the title of Duke or Duchess of Brittany after her death. Finally, Anne felt that she had done right by her homeland and begrudgingly returned to France to become its queen for a second time. Louis was 37 years old and often suffered from ill health, while Anne was only 22. However, the toll of 6 childbirths had already ravaged her body. At her third wedding, she was described as pale-faced and worn. Fortunately, this marriage proved to be much happier. Louis respected his wife and treated her as the queen she was. He honored her rights in Brittany and allowed her to visit the region frequently. Anne also built a tomb for her parents at Nantes Cathedral. With more freedom in her third marriage, Anne was able to fully embrace her love of art and music. She surrounded herself with poets, philosophers, and artists, and she employed the finest musicians of the time. Anne became the first French queen to be a renowned patron of the arts. She commissioned a series of unicorn tapestries to celebrate her wedding to Louis XIV, which are now on display at the cloisters in New York City. She also commissioned several illuminated manuscripts and printed books, including the printing of Christine de Pizan's The City of Ladies, an early feminist work about a utopia run entirely by famous women from history. In 1498, Anne founded the chivalric order of the ladies of the court. While Europe was already filled with orders honoring important men, this was the first order for women. The emblem of the order, a knotted cord, could carry several religious meanings, but it was also interpreted as the cord that French widows traditionally tied around their arms, as well as a symbol of the bond binding the members together. The motto, Exor de air, meaning, I have a body untied, reflected Anne's own desire for physical freedom from the burdens of marriage and childbirth. As queen, Anne also formed a sort of finishing school for young ladies who came to her household to be educated in courtly etiquette and to meet eligible noble bachelors. This idea was modeled on the French court and played a significant role in diplomacy during her second reign as Queen of France. When King James IV of Scotland went to war against Henry VIII of England, France, ever the ally, sent James a turquoise ring and implored him to be her knight. Unfortunately, things did not end well for James, who was killed in battle. Despite the emotional independence Anne found away from her third husband, she became pregnant 5 times during their 7-year marriage. Her first daughter, Claude, inherited her hip displacement, but otherwise was healthy and survived to adulthood. Her second and third children, both sons, were stillborn. A fourth child, another healthy daughter named Renee, was born, followed by a third stillborn son. It was rumored that each stillbirth delighted the ambitious Louis of Savoy, whose son, Francis, was the presumptive heir. There were even whispers that Louis had used witchcraft to kill the queen's children, further complicating the already tense dynamics of their marriage. Anne of Brittany, having suffered the loss of so many children, felt tentative joy as she watched her only surviving daughters grow. She doted on them, ensuring they received a proper education. Anne even commissioned a primer for her 8-year-old daughter, Claude, which featured Anne's personal coat of arms instead of her father's. This was a clear sign of the mother instilling the values of independence and pride in her daughter. Anne's greatest wish was to secure Brittany's freedom after her death, ensuring the duchy would pass on to one of her daughters. Since only a male could inherit the French throne, both Claude and Renee were free to rule Brittany. To achieve this, Anne hoped to betroth Claude to Charles of Austria, the future Holy Roman Emperor, Charles XV, whose immense power could secure Brittany's independence from France. However, King Louis X refused and instead arranged for Claude's marriage to his own heir presumptive, Francis of Angoulême, ensuring that his bloodline would continue to occupy the French throne. Louis also planned to name Renee as the heir to Brittany, but Anne refused, as she clearly saw Louis's intent to absorb Brittany into the French crown. Furious, Anne left him and returned to Brittany. Publicly, she claimed she was going on a pilgrimage to pray for Louis's health, but in reality, she simply needed to get away from him. Louis, anxious about her absence, pestered his courtiers multiple times a day to inquire about her return. Once, when Louis was gravely ill, a chamberlain found Anne preparing to return to Brittany as a widow. The queen had to be stopped, as the king was improving and asking for her. Anne, however, did not live to become a widow. She died on January 9, 1514, from a kidney stone attack, a condition her body, weakened by 11 pregnancies, could not overcome. She was only 36 years old. Heartbroken, Louis spent days in seclusion, grieving her death. He arranged for the most spectacular funeral ever staged on French soil, commissioning an illuminated manuscript that recorded every detail, which would later serve as a model for royal funerals across Europe for centuries. The funeral lasted for 40 days, during which multiple masses and requiems were held. Anne's body, sealed in a lead coffin and wooden casket, was laid to rest in a magnificent double mausoleum made of Carrara marble. Louis would eventually join her there in the Basilica of Saint-Denis. However, their tomb was desecrated during the French Revolution in 1793, and their remains were thrown into a mass grave. Louis did fulfill one of Anne's wishes by sending her heart back to Brittany. The heart was encased in a golden reliquary topped with a crown and placed in her parents' tomb. Although the heart was destroyed during the Revolution, the reliquary survives and is still on display at the Dubé Museum in Nantes. After Anne's death, Louis, now 52 and in poor health, was desperate for a male heir. He hastily married Mary Tudor, the 18-year-old sister of Henry VIII of England, and frantically tried to get her pregnant. However, Louis died just 3 months into their honeymoon, supposedly from overexertion in the bedroom. When it became clear that Mary was not carrying the next king of France, she was allowed to return to England, where she promptly eloped with the man she truly loved. Upon Louis's death, Francis III inherited the French throne, and Claude, Anne's 14-year-old daughter, stood by his side. Claude helped raise her younger sister, Renée, and even commissioned a copy of the special book her mother had given her. Over the next 10 years, Claude endured 7 pregnancies, but her body could not withstand the strain. She died at just 24 years old from exhaustion, though 5 of her children survived, and through her son, Henri II, Brittany was fully incorporated into the French throne. Renée, on the other hand, married Hercules II of Este, Duke of Ferrara. They had 5 children together, and Renée became an important supporter of the Protestant Reformation. She lived to the age of 63.